We're looking today at living by faith. We looked yesterday at walking by faith, and now we're looking at living by faith. By faith, Hebrews 11, verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And he went out not knowing whither he went. I love that. Abraham went out not knowing where he was going. He was living by faith. He was walking by faith. And as I said, I've lived by faith for 50 years. And there's something else I want to mention to you as well about this living by faith. In 50 years of trusting God to provide, I have never publicly or in newsletters or anything shared any personal needs with people. I've shared the ministry's needs, like if I'm going to preach to several million people in the Philippines, I'll give people the opportunity to sow into that. If they don't, it's their loss, not mine, because I believe that there is a great heavenly reward for those who sow into evangelism where millions are being won for Jesus. And so I'll give people an opportunity. But I've been through, you can't even imagine the financial challenges that I've faced over the years, but I've never shared them with other people. I just go to God. I plant my seeds. I trust God that He's going to provide. And as I said, 50 years of ministry, I've never shared personal needs with anyone, not taking a salary out of the ministry. I've just believed for God to provide, and He has. And here's a funny one. I pioneered, among British preachers, I pioneered staying in hotels. As a young evangelist, we always stayed with families in their homes. And there were some nice families that I stayed with over the time, but I also had some horrendous experiences. When the team, and it was quite a big evangelistic team that I was a part of when I first started out in ministry, when we would go to a city with a big gospel tent for 19 days. And so they would scrape the barrel. They would ask people, will you have a preacher stay with you for 19 days? And so often it was the wife who said yes, and the husband was not a believer, and he's like, oh no, we've got this preacher staying in our home for 19 days. Some funny things. I've got to tell you one. Wilf Darwood, who his brother Mike Darwood was the Bible teacher for the ministry, and Wilf was a bit of a scatterbrain. You'd get shot in America if he did that. One night he went home, and he walks in the house. He sits down on the sofa. The couple are watching TV. He sits there, just sits watching television with them. And then he looks around and he thinks, I don't recognize this house. And he'd gone to the wrong home. He'd walked in, he'd sat down watching TV. And they hadn't said, who are you? What are you doing in our house? They just carried on watching TV. And he didn't even apologize. He just got up and walked out the house. Only in Britain can you get away with, anybody from Britain who's there will realize that the British are sometimes so polite. I was one of the American vacation holiday movies where they're in Britain and they and he knocks a man off his bike in his car, and the man he knocks off the bike gets up and apologizes, and that's the kind of concept a lot of people have. But so I actually had not as bad as the one I told you about, Wilf. I had an experience once where I drove up to this house and parked in the car in the driveway, and the couple walked out, and I said hi, and they said hi, and I got my case out of the car to walk into the house, and I said thanks for having me stay with you, and they said, oh, we weren't expecting you, and I said, oh. But I wrote to you telling you that I was coming. Oh, well, we didn't get a letter. And so I pulled out this letter and showed them. And it was the next door neighbors. They had a divided driveway, and I turned right instead of left. So some funny things, but also some horrendous experiences. I must have stayed in hundreds of houses during the first 10 years of ministry. I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that I probably stayed in 1,000 different homes. And as I said, some of them were nice, but had some also which were so dirty, mold and damp. The guest room, which they didn't heat, and so I was in. I know one preacher who used to take a raincoat with him to sleep in because the beds were sometimes so damp. You have to understand that it's often cold and rainy in Britain. And unaired beds, unwashed sheets. I've had to gone to get into bed, and there's every shade of body hair you could imagine where they've had past guests and haven't haven't washed them. The worst experience I had where I had to say, no, I'm going to have to go somewhere else. I arrived at this little old house. It was, I think, in Leeds, in England, and this little old man came to speak to me, and he spat when he talked. You know, you had to wear a raincoat now, and they put me to stay in his home. And so I bring my case into the house. There's this little narrow staircase, and he said, let me take you to your room. So I said, thank you very much. So I struggled up these narrow stairs with my case, and he opens the door, and there's this little room with a little double bed. His wife had recently died, and he said, I sleep on the left side. Which side do you want to sleep on? So I pioneered staying in hotels. I said, no, I'm not going to put you out. And no, it's not putting me out. It's fine. No, I'm not going to put you out. And so I went down the road. Even though most days I was getting like $25 to $100 max offerings when I went to preach anywhere, I pioneered staying in hotels and certainly a lot longer before any of the other preachers that I knew, and believing God for it. People would say, "Oh, you can stay in a home." I'd say, "Well, I'm blessed. You got a nice home," but some people like to show off their homes, but I like my space. And so let me tell you another miracle that happened. At that same convention where God provided the meal for me and sent somebody to pay it, it was during my first week. I don't know if I mentioned that to you. It was my first week in full-time ministry. And it was an unusually hot Easter in England. It was an Easter convention, and the convention was being held in Ipswich's Tackett Street Congregational Church, which had varnished pews. And when Tony Metrick, the worship leader, he said, let's stand and worship the Lord. And as I stood, I heard this, felt this restraint as if I'd stuck to the seat, and a ripping noise. And as I said, it was a hot Easter, and the varnish on the pews, you know, the pews are the long seats in the old-fashioned churches. My jacket had stuck to it, and I had a black velvet jacket, and nobody saw it, but I put my hand behind me, and I felt my jacket stuck to the chair, a hairy pew, and I felt my jacket, and I realized that there was a big bald patch in my jacket where the velvet had stuck to the pews, and nobody else saw it, nobody heard it. I quickly removed my bald jacket and prayed, Lord, I need a new one. I just remember praying this. I said, Lord, I need a new one, and I'd like a brown one. I hadn't realized at the time that brown's not the best color for me. Now, I was not the main speaker. I'd just come out as a young guy, about 20 years of age, come out into full-time ministry, serving God, and they'd given me the youth meetings to do. There was a small handful, maybe 4 or 5 young people. We didn't take any offerings because there was no money for them to give. And I was speaking with them, but nobody knew about my jacket. It wasn't somebody saw it, and nobody knew. I folded it up and just told God. Well, that evening, a young man about 17 years of age walked into the service and handed me a brown paper parcel. And he said, I was out shopping today, and the Lord told me to get you this. I opened it, and in the package was a brown velvet jacket. He said, I hope it fits. I said, the Lord knows my size. And I wore that jacket for many years. But again, having to trust God, I had a testimony of his provision. No test, no testimony. And since that time, I've learned to trust God to provide, not knowing where my next dollar is going to come from. And 50 years later, I'm still living by faith with no regular salary from the church or ministry, trusting God that he's going to speak to people. And I want to tell you, it doesn't get any easier. The bills just get bigger. The larger your ministry gets, the costlier it is. Some people, they say, oh, well, that's a big ministry. But along with the ministry growing, the costs grow as well. But I've discovered that God is faithful. And I have to believe God for not just for my own needs, but also for television ministry and crusade ministry around the world. It's a big step of faith. I remember, I think I've told you the story about the man who came to me crying, and he said, I've got so much debt. And I said, how much debt do you have? And I was tempted to laugh because what to him was a great debt. That was my daily budget, the amount I have to believe for every day to cover the expenses of the ministry. So thank you to the partners of this ministry who support this and help cover the costs of it. I want to tell you, flying out and ministering to millions of people in Asia is no small bills. But I've discovered over the years that God is faithful. God is never late. He's rarely early, but he's never late. And many times the devil's tried to put me into a panic, but God has provided. As I told you, challenging times come, but trust the Lord. No test, no testimony. And I don't know what you're going through at the moment, but I remember the words. I love the words of the song of Andre Crouch. If I never had a problem, I wouldn't know that God could solve them. I'm believing with you for a miracle.